All right, we've made it through the European theater, and now we're going to hop over to the other side of the planet and discuss the Pacific theater of the Second World War. Now, to begin, we want to go actually back to the post-World War I years. This is covered in a bit more detail in the Move to Global War videos on this channel. But let's just talk really quickly about the U.S. and Japanese relationship since World War I. It hasn't really been great. Japan is feeling mistreated by the Paris Peace Conference. They don't think the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles is commensurate with Japanese power in 1919. They also, remember, wanted to get that racial equality clause fit in to the Treaty of Versailles, and that didn't fly with Britain and France. A few years later, the United States is going to pass the Immigration Act of 1924 that is referred to by some as the Japanese Exclusion Act, which essentially bars Japanese immigration to the United States. This is seen as a national humiliation for Japan. These countries also have economic rivalries. Western European nations and the United States all have interests in East and Southeast Asia. And Japan certainly has interest in East and Southeast Asia. Japan needs resources, especially in light of the onset of the Great Depression and nations putting tariffs on foreign goods and beginning to restrict trade. This causes Japan to look towards territory on the mainland Asia, in Manchuria, and later China and Southeast Asia. For Western powers, this is seen as a threat to their open door policy, that China was to be open for Western powers to do business. If Japan were to swoop in, that might change that equation. The Manchurian crisis is going to increase international tensions, but this did not push the United States to launch any kind of economic sanctions against Japan. In 1937, in the Sino-Japanese War, the United States will offer some aid to the Chinese, but it still does not restrict trade with Japan. Things start to turn ugly during that second Sino-Japanese War when Japanese bombers will sink an American ship called the USS Panay in Shanghai, along with 3 tankers from the Standard Oil Company, killing a couple Americans, wounding many more. The United States demanded an apology, a payment for this, a guarantee that any future transgressions would cease. President Roosevelt was criticized for having American ships even in a war zone at this time, but recall that neither Japan nor China had ever declared war on each other, so this didn't really fit all of the neutrality acts that had been passed by the American Congress. We do see anti-Japanese sentiments on the rise, though. And as more and more news came out about the Japanese bombing of civilian targets in Shanghai and beyond, the United States will issue, or the president will issue, what's called a moral embargo. And this is not a prohibition. This is not like, saying that companies can't do business with Japan. It is just saying that the United States would not look favorably on any companies that sold planes or parts for planes that were used in civilian attacks. Now, Japan is not going to stop with China, of course, and they've got this greater goal of making what they call a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This is putting kind of a nice name on the fact that Japan wants to push out Western imperialists and replace them with Japanese imperialists. Japan sees East Asia and Southeast Asia as what could be living space and resources for growing Japanese populations. And after World War I or World War II begins in Europe, the fall of France and the fall of Netherlands, both countries that hold major overseas territories in East Asia and Southeast Asia, Japan hopes to capitalize on the weakness of these Western colonial powers. In July of 1940, the United States is going to retaliate against Japanese expansion with what's known as the Export Control Act, where we'll stop the sale of war materials to Japan. And other trade agreements would soon be canceled as well. So now we've got this increasing tension. We're starting to put some economic sanctions onto the Japanese. Japan will enter into that tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September of 1940, where each nation would aid each other in the event of war. And this is really specifically targeted at the United States. If war were to come with the United States between any of them, they would all join in. In April of 1941, Japan, with eyes on expanding further to the south, enters into a non-aggression pact with Russia. Remember, Russia was also expanding in their west. They don't want it to tangle with the Japanese in the east. So this is a mutually beneficial agreement. They're going to be neutral if either party went to war. This frees Japan up from any concerns in its north to push into Southeast Asia. The United States will respond to this by expanding our forces in the Philippines. Japan will invade French Indochina in July of 1941. And French Indochina is just a hop away from the American holdings in the Philippines. The United States will cut all oil, rubber, and iron sales to Japan. Japan is going to freeze U.S. assets, or pardon me, Japan will freeze U.S. assets that are held in Japan, and trade will essentially stop between these two nations. The United States will move to close the Panama Canal to Japanese shipping. Now we are on this fast track to war. Despite these tensions, negotiations will continue, but even while negotiations are happening in Washington, D.C. between the Japanese and the Americans, the Japanese are preparing for a greater conflict. In October of 1941, Hideki Tojo becomes Japan's premier. Remember, he was a general in the Japanese military, and now this firmly puts the Japanese military in control of the Japanese civilian government. Japan has a desperate need for oil, so they start planning to attack British Malaya with its oil fields and Dutch Indonesia with its oil fields. Fearing attacks from American and British navies, Japan starts to put together plans to attack the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That is the home base in Hawaii to America's Pacific Fleet. Negotiations will ultimately fail as Japan refuses to remove its armies from China, and the United States is going to refuse to stop aiding the Chinese. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks the Americans at that base of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. At the same time, they will launch simultaneous attacks on many other Western holdings in Asia: Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Guam, Midway Island of the United States, and the Philippines. The impact of this attack: the American fleet is badly damaged, many ships are lost, but our aircraft carriers were out to sea, which is very fortunate for the Americans at the time, as the aircraft carriers, the lifeblood of this modern Navy. Also, the narrow channel of that harbor was not blocked with destroyed ships, and so ships could still come in and come out of Pearl Harbor. The United States and the UK will declare war on Japan on the next day. And now we are in the Pacific War. It's a very different kind of war, obviously, because it's largely sea-based at the outset. Two major naval battles will take place in 1942. First, the Battle of the Coral Sea. This is just north of Australia, May of 1942. It's going to be the first battle in naval history where the two navies never actually saw each other. Aircraft from each other's aircraft carriers and submarines will do much of the fighting in this battle. Japan is going to lose 2 aircraft carriers to the United States 1, and it's ultimately a victory for the Americans. Japanese advance towards Australia was stopped. The Battle of Midway in July of 1942, and I see that I have typos all over the place on this one. That's killing me, but I'm not gonna, I gotta keep pushing. Japan is gonna lose 4 aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway in July of 1942. 50% of its carrier fleet at that time. The United States loses 1. Japan simply could not afford these types of losses to its major ships and in its navy, whereas the United States does have the capability of building new carriers through the war. The United States will then deploy what is known as an island hopping campaign, where American forces will invade and take over island after island after island on their way, getting closer and closer to mainland Japan. Each island will basically become a staging point for the next subsequent island. With the capture of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in early 1945, the United States could increase air raids on Japan. And these are going to be devastating. In Operation Meeting House on March 9th, 1945, Over 80,000 Japanese will be killed in one night following an incendiary raid on Tokyo. The United States recognized that much of the construction material of Tokyo was wood and paper walls within structures, and we purposely used incendiary bombs, bombs that were meant not just to explode, but to ignite. And the United States burned Tokyo almost to the ground. Japan was now defeated in the air and sea, but they still refused an unconditional surrender, which now puts the decision in the President of the United States' hands on what to do to get Japan to surrender. Truman is well aware that the United States would be declaring war on Japan in early August 1945. Military advisors had warned him that the United States needed to invade Japan in order to gain a surrender, and it would cost hundreds of thousands of American soldiers and many more Japanese civilians. So Truman is left with a decision. Does he invade Japan? Does he negotiate a surrender that might be unconditional, or that might not be unconditional, that might have some conditions? Does he assume the Soviet Union would enter the war and that would lead to a Japanese surrender? Does he demonstrate a bomb over Tokyo Bay? Or does he go even further and use an atomic weapon? Ultimately, he decides to use the bomb. In July of 1945, the United States will issue what is known as the Potsdam Declaration. And it is a call for Japan to unconditionally surrender or else face prompt and utter destruction. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was bombed. On August 9th, 1945, the city of Nagasaki was bombed. And finally, on August 14th, 1945, Japan would surrender and the war in the Pacific was over. That's all we've got for today. We'll be back very soon to talk about some of the wartime conferences.